more than 20 million Americans started gardening for the first time last year during the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of that interest was driven by shortages and quarantines that are now hopefully behind us. But for many people, there are still a lot of reasons to grow our own food. Better food security in the event of more shortages, better quality and nutrition, concerns about the safety of chemicals for our families and for the environment, and access to more variety. But with food costs rising and even more weather impacts expected, for many of us, this comes down to money. I am far from self-sufficient when it comes to producing my own food, but I think I have a fairly representative, manageable suburban garden. I'm going to break down how much I invested up front to create the garden, as well as how much I spend on an ongoing basis every year to produce out of it, what I produce, and how much I save in groceries. I grow the foods that my family eats, not necessarily the ones that would drive the absolute highest financial return. So while I do start from seed to save costs, and not everybody does that, overall I would still call the numbers I'm about to show you very doable for most people in the suburbs. I'll start with what I grow. I have 4 raised beds, each 4 feet by 8 feet, and arched cattle panel trellises spanning between them. One of them is a perennial bed filled with strawberries, and I'm ignoring it for the purposes of this video. Of the other 3, 2 are dedicated every year to spring and fall crops like chard, kale, arugula, radishes, carrots, and spinach, while the other bed is used for summer crops like paste tomatoes, peppers, squash, and basil. My vining tomatoes, beans, peas, melons all grow on the arched cattle panel trellises in between the beds, and those are rooted at the edges of all 3 of these beds. Overall, we eat out of this garden 3 seasons of the year, spring through fall. I will start with what we save. I do not keep strict records of how many ounces of everything we grow and how much it would be worth. Instead, I'm going to talk about what I really save, meaning what I stopped spending at the grocery store. For most people, I think this is the relevant data point, and it's the most conservative. If you don't normally buy organic, even though you're growing organic in your garden and that's worth more, you're only saving that much money if you normally do buy organic vegetables. What I've done for this video is to do a savings number for organic and for non-organic, so you can tailor it to your situation. Now, I do follow an autoimmune diet, so there's a lot of veggies on this list. And for that reason, my savings might be a little different than yours. But again, I think this is all pretty representative. Each week before I started gardening, we would purchase on average 1 bunch of kale, 3 bunches of spinach, 2 zucchini squash to make zoodles, around 4 bell peppers, usually 4 large tomatoes, and a package of cherry tomatoes. Here is the weekly cost of those items for organic and non-organic at my local Kroger. Now, we don't eat these out of the garden 52 weeks a year because they don't grow here 52 weeks a year. So here, I'm also showing the total weeks of production that I get across my 3 seasons of growing for each of these crops. If you take the weeks of production and multiply it by the total cost avoided each week, you get my total savings. It comes to roughly $325 a year for non-organic, or $480 a year if I was using organic as my baseline. Moving on to my expenses. Now, I do garden experiments all of the time and I invest in some of those, but I'm going to do the breakdown for just what it took to create this garden. That covers building the 4 beds, building these cattle panel trellises between them, and creating the row covers that I use on my spring and fall beds to protect from cabbage moths. Here is a detailed invoice, so to speak, of the expenses. The initial upfront expenses include the wood for the raised beds, cattle panel for the trellises, PVC pipe and fittings for the bed cover frames, along with the row cover material that covers it, and a basic set of hand tools. I've shown the expected life of each on this chart to give you a sense of how your investment plays out over time. I do start from seed, and I use a 50-50 blend of worm castings and coconut coir. I've included the cost of a soil blocker, trays to start seeds, the worm bin. These are all upfront costs that then massively reduce my expenses later. But if you wanted to use transplants every year, you could avoid those upfront costs, and instead you'd have, I think, $5, $6 per transplant every year after that. For me, that would add about $60 a year of extra cost, and so it made sense for me to invest in starting from seeds and the equipment to do that. That's what I'm going to reflect in the video as we go. For seed starting, I have upfront costs from the soil blocker, the worm bin, the trays that I use for my transplants, and our fluorescent shop lights setup. All in, it comes into around $570, though this could be done more cheaply using, as an example, reclaimed wood for the beds. For recurring costs, I have seeds. I do save mine every year, but pretend for a moment that I didn't. You do then have a seed expense. You have to buy them roughly every 3 or 4 years for the things that I grow, as well as the amendments, replacement light bulbs periodically, and biodegradable grow bags. All in, for me, it comes to around $60 a year of ongoing expense. Those doing the math in their heads will have already seen that we are cash negative the first year. I will re-emphasize, you should use reclaimed materials wherever you can to reduce upfront costs. As an example, we made our own sheet composting in the beds rather than buying soil. We reused our PVC we had from other projects. I'm just reflecting the total cost here. We didn't in fact buy it just for this. And overall, because I save seeds, I do avoid that seed cost every year. This again was for my pretty large garden. If you started with just 2 beds and did 1 panel in between, skipped the worm bin and bought some potting mix instead, you could cut your upfront expenses to more like $260, which would shorten your payback considerably. Note, I'm also not assuming you're doing any canning or drying or other preserving of the food. If you did, you could eat out of the garden much, much longer. I'm doing a bit of a worst case scenario and assuming you're only eating fresh. I did do a chart here of our cash costs and payback over time for this conservative scenario where I'm assuming you invest in 4 beds and in the worm bin up front. The first year we have a big outlay, and even with the cost savings, we're still negative. Your payback is faster if you're comparing to organic versus non-organic as your otherwise spend that you're avoiding here. But even with non-organic grocery savings, we are almost break even in year 2, and we're positive by a few $100 by year 3, going up steadily from there. Ultimately, the biggest benefits and the drivers of why I personally grow my own food are not cost, but it is a very real consideration and a potential constraint, and I wanted to be transparent about it for the purpose of this video. If you started gardening in 2020, I hope you keep going, and that you find, as I do, that growing your own food connects you with nature, seasonal rhythms, it encourages you to eat a bigger variety of nutritious and fresh foods, and overall it helps you find some peace and a sense of completeness and sufficiency in an otherwise crazy world. If I missed any benefits or significant costs, please flag them in the comments and I'll try and go back and address them. In the meantime, I hope you all find gardening as rewarding as I do. Thanks.